Hi everyone. Today I wanted to talk to all of you about something a little different. Being the son of a US citizen and a Mexican citizen, I've always lived in a unique intersection between two worlds. My first language was Spanish, but because my dad's family was spread so far and wide, most of my time was spent with my mother's side of the family. It was clear to me when we went to visit my grandparents in Mexico for the first time that something was missing from my identity, and I think a lot of you can probably relate. As I grew older, I asked myself, what could I do to make myself feel more closely connected to my Mexican heritage? And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I came to that answer. We were on a trip to Mexico, and I don't remember who exactly I was having this conversation with, but they let me know that if I had had a Mexican passport, the whole immigration process would have been way more seamless. And I guess I'd never considered the idea, but it got me thinking. Could I apply for a Mexican passport? And what does that mean for my American citizenship? All these things were going through my head, which after some thought ultimately brought me to my answer. I was going to apply for my Mexican citizenship. And yes, don't get me wrong, the thought of easier immigration checkpoints was definitely enticing, but for me it was more than that. It was the ability to say that I was a Mexican citizen. In the grand scheme of things, knowing the culture, being familiar with the people, and actually learning the language, not just proper Spanish, but the dialects from where your family's from, is way more important than all of this, which I have done all of that already. But for me, this was just like the cherry on top, all of this was going to culminate into this one piece of paper saying that I was a Mexican citizen. When I started this process, I researched it the best that I could. I was on forums, I was doing FAQs, I looked at the Consulate website in here in the US and in Mexico, and then I even watched a bunch of YouTube videos of expats that are people that have already gone through the process and everything. And then, here a whole year later, I want to share that experience with all of you. I do have some, tips and tricks that will hopefully help you along the way if this is something that interests you as well. But before we get into that, I want to talk about my first-hand experience. I still remember going in that morning to my consulate appointment. I was nervous, I was excited, I was anxious. I'd already been waiting 3 months for my appointment because the way it used to be set up is you emailed everything in. It took them about 3 months to get back to you, and then finally you're given an appointment. So I had all this anticipation building up inside of me. My dad had to take the day off work to go with me for this, and I'll explain why later. But I definitely was just elated to even be at the consulate, and I'm smiling ear to ear. I'm just very excited. We get there, I get checked in, and we sit down in the waiting area and wait for the registro civil. Basically, the registro civil in Mexico is how you register people. So in the US, when you're born, you automatically get your birth certificate given to you at the hospital at the time of birth. That's not how it's done in Mexico. In Mexico, the way it works is you're born at the hospital, you take the baby home, a week later, a month later, or whenever you decide, you go down to the registry office and you register the child, right? This is this child born on this day at this time to these parents, here's their grandparents, and you fill all that out. So a lot of it does fall on the parents, which is very different than the way it's done here. Because of my father's status as a citizen of Mexico, I automatically qualify to receive my citizenship through him. I filled out some paperwork detailing information about my grandparents from both sides of my family, notably their nationalities, their ages, I believe, and then their full names. And then that kind of served as my letter of naturalization that was submitted along with my application for my birth certificate. After I signed off that everything we had filled out was correct and that I was telling the truth and all that stuff, they submitted it to their database, and then it took about an hour for them to come back. And then when they came back, they gave me what's called a comprobante de registro, which is just the confirmation of your registration, which was that information about my grandparents and all that stuff, which basically that makes my birth certificate valid because obviously I was born in the US, not in Mexico. So in Mexico, you would just get your birth certificate, but because I'm a naturalized citizen, I need that comprobante to always be with my birth certificate so that those two items are valid. Sadly, I was not able to get my Mexican passport or my INE, which my INE is my voter registration card in Mexico. But as soon as I got home, I started making a plan on how to apply for my passport. And then after about a week of calling every single day, I was able to get another appointment about 3 weeks later. I went into that appointment with my US passport and my newly acquired Mexican birth certificate. And then after about 2 hours of my day and some more paperwork, I was able to get my Mexican passport. Sadly, because of an error on my part, I was not able to get my INE, but I am planning to do that at a later date because we still have some more appointments with the consulate as we're currently trying to get Jess's paperwork done as well. Something that I just want to emphasize here is that you have to be persistent. The appointments are very scarce. There's not a lot, and they only open up like 2 weeks prior every Wednesday, so you have to set reminders, send yourself calendar invites, whatever you need to do to make sure that you're on top of that process, because pretty much every service at the consulate is only done by appointment. You can't walk in and get stuff done. So unless you're calling, sending WhatsApp messages, or on their actual website doing your appointments, you're never going to get in to get this stuff done. Alright, so now for my tips and tricks section of the video. So I guess the first question you're going to want to ask yourself, or you're probably asking yourself, is do I qualify to get my Mexican citizenship? And the answer is pretty simple. If either one of your biological parents is a Mexican citizen, then you can qualify for citizenship, no questions asked. During my research, I did read that you can apply for citizenship if either one of your grandparents is a Mexican citizen, but it requires some more paperwork and some other requirements like residency status, but I didn't look into it too far because obviously not my situation, but I think that is something that also can be done. But like I said, just being the child of a Mexican citizen removes a lot of this red tape. So if this is something that you want your children maybe to have easy access to in their future, this is something you definitely want to consider for yourself. So for me, because I am now a naturalized Mexican citizen, my children would qualify to become citizens as well. When we're talking about documents, you are going to need some stuff from your parents, so you'll have to talk to them beforehand to get all this sorted out. You're going to need both of their physical birth certificates, not copies. And it doesn't matter if only one of your parents is a Mexican citizen, you need both of their certificates so that they can have verification of where your parents were born and what their name is at birth and all that stuff. That'll come into play later. In addition, you're going to need valid photo IDs for both of your parents. That's either like their driver's license. If they're a US citizen, they'll probably have a passport. That's what I would recommend more, is you take their passport so they can have that photo identification and be able to match it up to their name. The other thing is your parents' marriage license. Especially if your parents are married in the US, your mother's maiden name probably changed. They need that so they can link your mom's name back to your birth certificate. And then the last thing you're going to need is your birth certificate, your US birth certificate, a valid photo ID, and that could be your driver's license or your US passport. Those are probably the easiest two that you can have quick access to. A little side note on the topic of documents. Based on my experience, you definitely want to make sure you take your original copies of everything when you go to your appointment, because they're only going to accept original copies as valid documents. And also on that note, make sure that all of your documents are in good condition, like no rips, no tears, no folds. Like keep them in a manila envelope so that they're nice and clean. My father's birth certificate is kind of old at this point, and when he had it sent to the US, I think it was sent in a letter, and the way he explained it is he ripped the side of it to open it, and so he ripped like a piece of his birth certificate. They taped it back together, and that's how he's had it ever since. He's never gotten another copy of it printed. And so when we got there, they did make kind of a fuss about that this document was not, or should not be accepted because of the condition it's in, and that they would accept it this one time, but like for my sisters, if they ever want to do it, they said they wouldn't accept it again. He would need to get a new one printed out. So that's something to keep in mind, that beforehand you need to have those documents in order. Actually, when I sent in all of my stuff, because like I said, the process before used to be you emailed them all of your documents, they looked at it, then they gave you the go ahead. They looked at my birth certificate and they said, you have this really hard crease down the middle and we're not going to accept it. So you have to get a printout of it, like a brand new certified print from the courthouse, and bring that into your appointment. So I went down to my local courthouse, I got one printed, signed, paid for it, and it's the same thing. It's just, printed brand new. And then the last thing I will say, double check all of your documents for spelling errors. Something that we're dealing with right now is that Jess's mom's name is different on her birth certificate compared to her mom's birth certificate. There's like a discrepancy on how her name is spelled. So when we sent in all of Jess's stuff to the consulate, they were like, not lining up. Mom's name is different on these two documents. You need to get that fixed, and then we'll talk about it. So we're dealing with that right now, which isn't even the consulate, it's the US government. Like I said, with the marriage license thing, that's very critical as well. Your mom's name will have changed, right? And so they'll want to make sure that what her name was before lines up with their birth certificate, and what her name is now looks correct on the marriage license and your birth certificate, so that all of these things line up. So you want to double check before you do any of this stuff in case you have to do paperwork beforehand. Another note is that if your parents were married before you were born and you are over the age of 18, you actually don't need anybody to go with you to your appointment. However, if you do not meet both of these prerequisites, one of your parents will have to accompany you in order to sign off on these documents. This is normally the parent that is the Mexican citizen, but in the case that both of your parents are Mexican citizens, only one of them is required to go. The next thing I want to talk about is the appointment process. It is definitely way more streamlined than when I just applied last year. Before, like I said, you have to email your documents to the consulate. They would review them, and then after about 3 months, you could request an appointment date after they approved that everything was correct. From what I read on the website and from like how everything looks, I'm pretty sure you can just make your appointment now. You don't have to do any of that other email stuff. So like I said, the website will be right here, and it'll also be in the description below if you want to go and check that out. And then something about the appointments that I want to make note is, I recommend you make your appointment in the earliest time slot available. So I didn't do that. I picked a little bit later in the day because it's in Fresno and it was a little bit of a drive, but it will be worth it if you make it earlier. One, they definitely can get backed up and that causes longer wait times. So earlier in the day, the better, especially if you're the first person. And then, like I said, from my experience, you normally aren't able to get your passport in the same day that you get your birth certificate. But if you go early enough in the morning, and it's something that I saw with the group that happened right before me because they got done early enough, sometimes they will let you go just get in line and get your Mexican passport with your newly acquired documents that you just got right then and there. So you could go from the registro straight into the line to get your passport and your INE. So that's a cool thing. But again, that's totally up to the discretion of the people working. But if it's early in the day, more likely before it gets full. Next, I will be showing you some footage I took from the Consulate website. So all of the consulates here in the US have their own website. This one is a specific website for Fresno. You know it's the Consulate website because it says Relaciones Exteriores, which are exterior relations. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll get to all of these icons here that show you different web pages within the website that you can go to. The one that I just clicked on is Servicios a Personas Mexicanas, which are services for Mexican people. And then this is the landing page. It takes you with different tabs here. The one that you want is Registro Civil y Poderes Notarias. And if you go down to the third one there, it says Doble Nacionalidad. That's dual citizenship. It details the stuff you're going to need to be able to do your dual citizenship. It does make a note here that you need to make sure that you have all your original documents. And if you need to make an appointment, you can do it on that website there, which I've given you the website as well. And then in addition, if you have any questions, you can email that email they have for you guys. But do be warned, they do take sometimes several months to respond to emails. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the documents that I recommend applying for. So obviously now we have our birth certificate and our letter of naturalization that validates all that information. Where can we go from there, right? So obviously we want to get our passport, and for me, I recommend getting the 10-year passport. That is $200. It is a little more expensive, but I think in the long run it's beneficial because especially with the way things are going and with the current tourist tax prices and everything for flights out of the US into Mexico, you're paying upwards of $50 per flight in tourist tax. So after 4 flights, which is just 2 trips there and back, you've already paid for the passport. But again, that's totally preference on how long you get it. I believe they do 1, 3, 5, and 10 year. I got the 10-year passport just so that longevity wise, I have it for a long time before I have to go back and get it redone. If you're not really the type that's going to fly, but you are going to cross the land border, or I think even the sea border, like if you take like a cruise, I would recommend you get the matrícula consular, which is like a passport, or it is a passport essentially, but it's the card one, right? And you can have that in your wallet. It is an identification. It has a picture of you and everything. It's basically like if you've ever crossed in Southern California, they have the American passport that's just the card version. It's not the booklet. And that works for all ports of entry that isn't flying. I know my aunt that lives down in Chula Vista uses that one because they cross frequently and stuff like that. So it's a situation of what do you want. I recommend the booklet just because if you're going to fly, that way you already have it. It does what the other one can't, but it is bulky, right? You're talking about a whole passport book versus just the card that can fit in your wallet. So that's up to preference. But that's where my recommendation for this third card comes in, is your INE, which is your voter registration card in Mexico. I think that is a great alternative to your matricula because it kind of serves the same purpose, right? You don't want to be carrying your Mexican passport around all the time, but you do want a valid form of Mexican identification, right? So that's going to have your information, your picture, your voter registration. The way that works is when you apply for it, they take your location of birth and that's where you're registered, right? In that state. So the problem with us that are born in the US is we don't have a state. So they go off of what's on your parents' birth certificate. So that's where we get into the situation where I wasn't able to get my INE because I showed up and they were like, okay, you were born in the US, where's your dad's birth certificate? And I was like, at home. And they're like, okay, well, we can't register you to vote because we need his to validate where you'd be like registered to vote, right? So same thing as like, I'm a resident of California. I can only vote in California, just like my dad is a resident of Michoacan. So I would only be able to vote in that state for those elections and obviously the national elections. But at some point I will have that, so that'll be okay. And that's where that trick comes in, where if you come in early enough in the morning for your birth certificate, you will have all of those documents anyways and be able to get all of those other things. But with all that in mind, if you have any other questions, you can post them down below in the comment section and I will try to help you to the best of my ability. Thank you all for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed.